The year is 421 BC, and in a small bedroom in Athens, a young bride named Lysistrata is preparing for her wedding night in the most peculiar way imaginable. She's not putting on perfume or arranging her hair. Instead, she's carefully tying a rope around her waist, not once, not twice, but 7 times in a complex knot that would make a sailor weep with envy. This isn't some ancient Greek bondage ritual, mind you. This is a sacred tradition called the knot of Hercules, and according to Athenian custom, only her new husband can untie it. But here's the catch. He has to do it in complete darkness, using only one hand, while reciting the names of all 12 Olympian gods in the correct order. Get Zeus mixed up with Poseidon, back to the beginning. Forget about Dionysus, start over. Some grooms spent their entire wedding night wrestling with rope instead of, well, you get the idea. The knot was so complex that there are recorded cases of couples calling in professional rope handlers the next morning, red-faced and exhausted, to help sort out the matrimonial mess. And this, dear listeners, is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the absolutely bizarre sexual customs of ancient Greece. Tonight, we're diving deep into a world where olive oil wasn't just for cooking, but for sexual lubricant, where gymnasium meant something very different than your local fitness center, and where the phrase Greek love had meanings that would make a philosophy professor blush. So before you settle in for this journey through the marble-columned corridors of ancient romantic peculiarities, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into history's more creative moments. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, probably all grateful they weren't born in ancient Athens. Now, dim the lights, maybe pour yourself some wine, definitely not mixed with honey and strange herbs like they did back then. And let's embark on tonight's journey through the olive groves and symposiums of ancient Greece, where love, lust, and logic created combinations that would puzzle even the wisest philosophers. Your story begins not in the golden age of Pericles or the conquests of Alexander, but in the everyday lives of ordinary Greeks who had to navigate a social system so complex it made modern dating apps look simple. Ancient Greece wasn't just one culture. You see, it was a collection of city-states, each with its own rules, customs, and deeply bizarre ideas about how human relationships should work. In Athens, the supposed birthplace of democracy and rational thought, they had developed a system of courtship so elaborate it required professional consultants. These weren't matchmakers in the modern sense, they were more like relationship engineers, experts in the intricate social machinery that determined who could marry whom, when, and under what circumstances. Take the institution of the hetairai, for instance. These weren't prostitutes exactly, though that's often how they're mistranslated. They were highly educated, sophisticated women who provided companionship to wealthy Athenian men. But here's where it gets weird. They were often more intellectually respected than wives. A man's wife was expected to stay home, manage the household, and remain largely silent in public. His hetaira, meanwhile, might debate philosophy with him, compose poetry, and attend dinner parties where she was expected to be witty, charming, and intellectually stimulating. It was like having a system where your accountant stayed home and balanced the books while your debate partner got to go to all the interesting parties. The cognitive dissonance would be amusing if it weren't so thoroughly ingrained in their social structure. The most famous hetaira in history was probably Aspasia, who was the partner of Pericles himself. She was so influential that comic playwrights of the time wrote entire plays mocking her political power. Imagine if Saturday Night Live spent entire seasons roasting the president's girlfriend for being too smart and having too much influence. That was essentially Aspasia's life. But Aspasia was exceptional even among the hetairae. Most of these relationships followed strict protocols that make modern dating seem refreshingly spontaneous. There were rules about gifts, about public appearances, about conversation topics, even about which philosophical schools a hetaira was allowed to discuss. Some specialized in Stoic philosophy, others in Platonic ideals. It was intellectual dating with a curriculum. The selection process was equally bizarre. Wealthy Athenians didn't just choose a hetaira based on beauty or charm. They considered her education, her conversational skills, her knowledge of music and poetry, and most importantly, her reputation for discretion. A hetaira who gossiped about her patrons would find herself unemployed faster than a philosopher who questioned the gods in public. The financial arrangements were complex too. It wasn't simply a matter of payment for services. These were ongoing relationships that might last for years, involving contracts, property arrangements, and sometimes even adoption of children. Some hetaira who accumulated enough wealth to become influential patrons of the arts themselves. A few even founded their own schools of philosophy. But perhaps the strangest aspect was how these relationships fit into Athenian marriage law. A man could be legally married, maintain a relationship with a hetaira, and also engage in what they called gymnasium friendships with younger men, all simultaneously, and nobody thought this was particularly unusual. In fact, it was considered a sign of a well-rounded social life. The wives, meanwhile, lived in a completely separate social universe. They rarely left their homes except for religious festivals, had minimal education, and were expected to find fulfillment entirely within the domestic sphere. It was like two parallel societies existing in the same city, with completely different rules and expectations. This brings us to the marriage customs themselves, which were so elaborate they make modern weddings look like casual encounters. The process began with the betrothal, which was less about the bride and groom getting to know each other, and more about their fathers negotiating what amounted to a complex business deal. The negotiations could take months, not just about dowry, though that was important, but about everything from where the couple would live, to which gods they would honor in their household shrine. There were contracts specifying how many children were expected, what would happen if the wife proved infertile, and even clauses about what constituted acceptable grounds for divorce. The bride, meanwhile, had about as much input in these discussions as a prize sheep at a livestock auction. She might not even meet her intended husband until the wedding ceremony itself. In some cases, marriages were arranged when the bride was still a child, to be consummated years later when she reached what they considered marriageable age, usually around 14 or 15. The wedding ceremony itself was a multi-day affair that combined religious ritual, community celebration, and what can only be described as elaborate psychological theatre. It began with the proaulia, a pre-wedding ceremony where the bride was ritually bathed in water, carried from a sacred spring. This wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about spiritual purification, preparing her to leave her father's household and join her husband's family. The water had to be carried by unmarried girls in special vessels called lautrophoros, which were decorated with scenes of marriage and fertility. If no suitable unmarried girls were available, the family had to hire professional water carriers, who were usually priestesses or other religiously qualified women. The whole thing was so ritualized that there were specific songs that had to be sung, specific routes the water carriers had to take, even specific times of day when the bathing could occur. After the ritual bath, the bride was dressed in special wedding garments that were often family heirlooms, passed down through generations. These weren't just pretty dresses, they were loaded with symbolic meaning. The veil, for instance, was meant to protect her from evil spirits during the transition from maiden to wife. The belt was tied in that complex knot of Hercules we mentioned earlier. Even her shoes had to be a specific color and style, usually red or yellow, to symbolize the earth's fertility. The groom's preparation was equally elaborate, though in different ways. He had to undergo ritual purification as well, but his focused more on demonstrating his readiness to take on the responsibilities of a household. This included sacrifices to various gods, public declarations of his ability to support a wife, and in some city-states, demonstrations of physical fitness and military readiness. In Sparta, the groom's preparation was particularly intense. He had to prove his worthiness, not just financially, but physically and militarily. There were tests of strength, endurance, and combat skills. A man who couldn't handle a spear properly wasn't considered ready to handle a wife and future children. The logic was that marriage wasn't just about personal happiness, it was about producing the next generation of warriors. The actual wedding ceremony varied from city-state to city-state, but in Athens it typically involved the bride being formally transferred from her father's house to her husband's in a torch-lit procession called the Pompeii. This wasn't just a pretty parade, it was a legal ceremony that officially changed the bride's status in society. The bride rode in a decorated cart, accompanied by her female relatives and friends, while the groom walked alongside or rode separately. The procession followed specific routes through the city, stopping at various shrines and sacred sites where offerings were made to ensure the marriage would be blessed by the gods. But here's where it gets really interesting. The community was expected to participate. Neighbors and strangers were supposed to throw flowers, nuts, and dried fruits at the couple for luck. Children ran alongside the procession singing traditional wedding songs. Even people who didn't know the family were expected to offer blessings and good wishes. It was like a citywide celebration of the fact that two people were about to start having socially sanctioned relations. The whole community had a vested interest in the success of the marriage because successful marriages meant legitimate children, which meant the continuation of the citizen class. The procession ended at the groom's house, where the real ceremony began. The bride was welcomed by her new mother-in-law, who performed various rituals to incorporate her into the household. These included offerings to the household gods, the sharing of special foods, and the presentation of household items that the bride would now be responsible for maintaining. But the most important moment was the anacalypteria, the unveiling of the bride. This was the first time the groom officially saw his new wife's face, assuming they hadn't met before, which was often the case. Imagine the pressure. You've just committed to spending your life with someone, and you're about to find out what they look like. Sometimes this went well, sometimes it didn't. There are recorded cases of grooms fainting, of brides bursting into tears, of family members having to intervene to prevent the ceremony from falling apart entirely. But once the veil was lifted, there was no backing out. The marriage was considered legally binding from that moment forward. After the unveiling came the wedding feast, which could last for days. This wasn't just a party. It was a complex social ritual that served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the family's wealth and status, it allowed the community to witness and validate the marriage, and it provided an opportunity for the bride and groom to be publicly recognized as a new household unit. The seating arrangements at these feasts were carefully planned according to social hierarchy and family relationships. The food served had symbolic meanings: pomegranates for fertility, honey for sweetness in the marriage, wine mixed with water for the proper balance of passion and reason in the relationship. The entertainment was equally symbolic. There were traditional songs about famous mythological couples, dances that told stories of divine marriages, and poetry competitions, where guests composed verses celebrating the union. Some of these competitions got quite elaborate, with professional poets being hired to compose original works for the occasion. But perhaps the most bizarre aspect of Greek wedding feasts was the institution of ritual mockery. Guests were not only allowed but expected to make jokes at the expense of the bride and groom. This wasn't meant to be cruel, but rather to ward off the evil eye and ensure that the couple wouldn't become too proud or complacent in their happiness. The jokes followed traditional formats and were often quite elaborate. There were songs that listed all the ways the marriage might fail, poems that exaggerated the flaws of both partners, and dramatic performances that portrayed the couple in ridiculous situations. The bride and groom were expected to laugh along good-naturedly, even when the humor was rather pointed. This tradition of ritual mockery served a psychological purpose as well, by acknowledging all the potential problems and failures up front. In a humorous context, the community was helping the couple prepare for the inevitable challenges of married life. It was like an ancient form of couples therapy disguised as entertainment. The festivities continued until it was time for the final ritual, the katakasmata, the showering of the couple with nuts, dates, and other symbols of fertility. This was the signal for the couple to retire to their bridal chamber, where they would finally consummate their marriage. But even this wasn't straightforward. The bedchamber had to be prepared according to strict protocols. Special herbs were burned to purify the air and ward off evil spirits. The bed was sprinkled with rose petals and other flowers associated with Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Amulets and charms were placed around the room for protection. Outside the chamber, the wedding guests continued celebrating, but in a more subdued manner. There were specific songs that were sung during this time, prayers that were offered for the couple's fertility and happiness. In some city-states, the celebration continued all night, with guests taking turns guarding the door to protect the couple from evil influences. The morning after brought its own set of rituals. The couple was expected to make offerings to various gods, thanking them for a successful wedding night. There were traditional foods that had to be shared, usually consisting of bread, honey, and wine, symbolizing the sustenance, sweetness, and joy that were hoped to characterize the marriage. But perhaps most importantly, there was the apaulia, the morning gift ceremony. The groom was expected to present his new wife with gifts that demonstrated his commitment to her and his ability to provide for their future household. These weren't just tokens of affection, they were legally significant property transfers that affected the wife's status and security. The gifts had to be appropriate to the family's social status and financial situation. Too lavish, and the groom might be criticized for showing off or for poor financial judgment. Too modest, and he might be seen as stingy or lacking in proper respect for his wife. There were social consultants whose job it was to advise on appropriate gift-giving for various social classes and situations. Common gifts included jewelry, clothing, household items, and sometimes even property or slaves. But the most significant gift was often something called a hedge, which was essentially a financial security fund that the wife could access if her husband died or divorced her. This was an early form of insurance that provided women with some economic protection in a society where they had limited legal rights. The hedge negotiations could be quite complex, involving not just the immediate families but extended relatives and even business partners. The amount and terms were matters of family honor and social status. A generous hedge demonstrated the groom's prosperity and his commitment to his wife's welfare. A stingy hedge could damage both families' reputations. These morning gift ceremonies were also occasions for the broader community to evaluate the new marriage. Friends, neighbors, and business associates would observe the gifts and the ceremony, drawing conclusions about the couple's prospects for success. A well-conducted apaulia could enhance a family's social standing, while a poorly managed one could damage their reputation for years to come. After all the wedding ceremonies were complete, the couple still faced months of additional social rituals as they established themselves as a new household unit. There were religious obligations to fulfill, community ceremonies to participate in, and social visits to make to formally announce their married status to the broader network of family and friends. The bride, in particular, faced a period of intensive socialization into her new role. She had to learn the specific customs and traditions of her husband's family, master the management of their particular household, and establish relationships with her new female relatives and neighbors. This process could take a year or more, and was often quite stressful for young women who were still essentially children themselves. The husband, meanwhile, had his own adjustments to make. Marriage marked his transition from youth to full adult status in the community. He was now expected to take on greater civic responsibilities, participate more actively in political life, and begin planning for the economic security of his future children. But all of this elaborate ritual and social machinery was just the beginning. Once the wedding ceremonies were over and the couple had settled into married life, they entered into a social system that was even more complex and bizarre than the courtship and wedding customs. The daily life of a married couple in ancient Greece was governed by an intricate set of rules and expectations that covered everything from how they should address each other in public to what kind of religious observances they should maintain in their home. These weren't just social niceties, they were legal and religious obligations that could have serious consequences if ignored. For instance, married couples were expected to maintain separate social circles. The husband's friends and associates were not necessarily the wife's friends and associates. In fact, in many cases, they were specifically kept separate. The husband might spend his evenings at symposiums discussing philosophy and politics with other men, while the wife spent her time with female relatives and neighbors, focusing on domestic concerns and religious activities. This separation wasn't just about social convention. It was about preventing conflicts of interest and maintaining proper family hierarchy. A wife who became too friendly with her husband's business associates might gain access to information or influence that could disrupt traditional gender roles. A husband who spent too much time with his wife's female relatives might be seen as weak or improperly dominated by women. The physical layout of Greek houses reflected these social divisions. The andron, or men's quarters, was where the husband entertained his male friends and conducted business. The gynaikion, or women's quarters, was where the wife managed the household and socialized with other women. These areas were often completely separate, with different entrances and even different servants. When the couple did interact, there were specific protocols to follow. In public, they were expected to maintain a certain distance and formality. A husband and wife who appeared too affectionate or intimate in public might be criticized for lack of self-control or improper behavior. The ideal was for them to appear as a well-coordinated business partnership rather than as lovers. This formality extended to their private interactions as well. There were appropriate times and ways for married couples to express affection, and these were often quite different from what we might consider natural or spontaneous. Physical intimacy, for instance, was supposed to be scheduled around various religious and social obligations. Certain times of the year were considered inauspicious for marital relations. These included various religious festivals, periods of mourning, times when either spouse was involved in important civic duties, and days associated with particular gods who were thought to disapprove of such activities. Couples were expected to keep track of these restrictions and plan their intimate lives accordingly. There were also physical and spiritual purification requirements. Both spouses were expected to bathe and pray before engaging in marital relations, and to perform additional purification rituals afterward. These weren't just matters of hygiene. They were religious obligations designed to ensure that the couple's relationship remained in harmony with divine will. The bedroom itself had to be properly prepared and maintained. There were specific herbs that had to be burned, particular arrangements of household gods that had to be maintained, even certain colors and fabrics that were considered appropriate for married couples' bedding. Getting these details wrong wasn't just aesthetically displeasing, it was potentially spiritually dangerous. Children, when they arrived, brought their own set of ritual obligations and social complications. The birth of a child was not just a family event, it was a community celebration that required extensive ceremony and gift-giving. But it was also an occasion for social judgment about the couple's worthiness as parents and citizens. The gender of the child mattered enormously. Sons were celebrated with elaborate ceremonies and expensive gifts. Daughters were welcomed, but with much less fanfare and considerably less expense. This wasn't just about personal preference, it reflected the economic and social realities of Greek life. Sons would eventually become citizens and heads of households themselves. Daughters would require dowries and would join other families upon marriage. The naming of children followed complex traditional formulas. The first son was usually named after his paternal grandfather, the second son after his maternal grandfather, the first daughter after her paternal grandmother, and so on. Deviating from these patterns without good reason could cause family conflicts and social criticism. The child-rearing process was highly ritualized as well. There were specific ceremonies for various milestones. The first time the child was taken outside the house, the first haircut, the beginning of formal education, the transition to adult clothing. Each of these occasions required appropriate sacrifices, feasts, and gift-giving. But perhaps most importantly, children brought the marriage under increased community scrutiny. A couple's success as parents was seen as a reflection of their moral character and their favor with the gods. Children who were sickly, poorly behaved, or unsuccessful were often seen as evidence of some flaw in the parents' relationship or spiritual condition. This created enormous pressure on married couples to not just produce children, but to raise them successfully according to community standards. Parents who failed in this responsibility might find themselves socially ostracized, professionally damaged, or even legally sanctioned. Boys and girls had very different educational paths, and parents had to make careful decisions about tutors, schools, and educational philosophies. These choices weren't just about academic success, they were about social positioning and family reputation. Wealthy families often hired professional educational consultants to help them make these decisions. These were usually retired teachers or philosophers who specialized in matching children with appropriate educational programs. The consultation process could be quite elaborate, involving assessments of the child's abilities, family resources, and social goals. But even families of modest means had to make careful educational choices. Sending a child to the wrong teacher or school could damage their future prospects and reflect poorly on the parents' judgment. There were social networks and informal communication systems that helped families share information about educational options, but navigating these required considerable social skill and knowledge. As children grew older and began to approach adulthood, parents faced new challenges in managing their social development. Teenagers in ancient Greece had considerable freedom compared to children, but they also faced greater social scrutiny and expectations. Parents had to balance allowing their children independence with protecting the family reputation. For boys, this usually meant managing their participation in athletic training, military preparation, and social activities at the gymnasium. For girls, it meant preparing them for marriage while protecting their reputation for modesty and virtue. Both processes required careful supervision and considerable social coordination. The gymnasium culture was particularly complex, and to modern sensibilities, quite bizarre. These weren't just places for physical exercise. They were social and educational institutions where young men developed the relationships and skills they would need as adult citizens. But they were also environments where the boundaries between friendship, mentorship, and romance were quite fluid. Young men at the gymnasium formed intense emotional bonds with both their peers and their elders. These relationships were considered educationally valuable and socially appropriate, but they also had romantic and physical dimensions that were openly acknowledged and discussed. The key was maintaining proper balance and avoiding relationships that were considered excessive or inappropriate. The older men who served as mentors and teachers at the gymnasium were expected to guide young men not just in physical and intellectual development, but in emotional and social development as well. This mentoring relationship often included elements that we might today consider romantic or sexual, but which were understood within a framework of education and character development. These relationships were highly regulated by social custom and law. There were appropriate ages for different types of relationships, proper ways of expressing affection and commitment, and clear boundaries that distinguished acceptable from unacceptable behavior. Violations of these norms could result in social ostracism or legal penalties. Parents had to navigate this system carefully when their sons began participating in gymnasium culture. They needed to ensure that their boys formed appropriate relationships that would enhance their social and educational development, while avoiding connections that might damage their reputation or future prospects. For married men, the gymnasium also served as an important social institution for maintaining friendships and business relationships. Many men continue to participate in gymnasium activities throughout their adult lives, though their roles evolved from students to mentors and eventually to elder advisors. This created interesting dynamics within marriages. A man's gymnasium relationships might be among the most important in his life, potentially even more emotionally significant than his relationship with his wife. This wasn't considered problematic or threatening to the marriage, but rather as a natural and healthy aspect of male social development. Wives generally had their own parallel social institutions, centered around religious activities, family networks, and domestic responsibilities. These relationships could be equally intense and important, though they were less visible in the historical record, because women's activities were less often documented by male historians and writers. The festival and religious calendar played a huge role in organizing these separate social worlds and occasionally bringing them together. Ancient Greece had numerous religious celebrations throughout the year, each with its own customs, obligations, and social opportunities. Some festivals were specifically for men, others for women, and some for mixed participation. The scheduling and social dynamics of these events were complex, requiring careful coordination between families and communities. Married couples had to balance their separate religious and social obligations with their joint responsibilities as a household unit. The most famous women's festival was probably the Thesmophoria, a celebration in honor of Demeter, the goddess of agriculture and fertility. This was a multi-day event that was exclusively for married women, and it involved elaborate rituals, feasting, and social activities that were kept strictly secret from men. The secrecy wasn't just about religious mystery. It was about creating a space where women could interact freely without male supervision or interference. During the Thesmophoria, normal social hierarchies were temporarily suspended, allowing women from different classes and backgrounds to mingle and form relationships that might not be possible in everyday life. These festivals served important social functions beyond their religious significance. They provided outlets for emotional expression, opportunities for political networking, and chances for married women to maintain connections with their birth families and childhood friends. They also offered rare opportunities for women to exercise leadership and authority, as the festivals were organized and managed entirely by women. Men had their own exclusive festivals, such as various athletic competitions and military commemorations. These events were equally important for maintaining male social networks and providing opportunities for political and business relationship building. But perhaps the most socially complex events were the mixed-gender festivals, where the entire community came together for religious celebration. These occasions required careful management of social interactions, with elaborate protocols for how married couples should behave, how unmarried young people should conduct themselves, and how different social classes should interact. The festival of Dionysus, for example, involved dramatic performances, wine consumption, and ritualized behavior that temporarily relaxed normal social restrictions. Married couples might interact more freely and affectionately than usual. Young people might engage in courtship activities that would normally be inappropriate, and social hierarchies might be playfully inverted. But these temporary relaxations of social norms were carefully contained and controlled. There were specific times when certain behaviors were acceptable, particular locations where normal rules were suspended, and clear signals for when regular social order should be restored. Overstepping these boundaries could result in serious social consequences. The wine culture associated with many festivals deserves special mention because it was so central to Greek social life and yet so carefully regulated. Wine wasn't just an alcoholic beverage. It was a sophisticated social tool used to facilitate conversation, establish hierarchies, and create bonds between individuals. The symposium, or drinking party, was a central institution in Greek male social life. These weren't casual gatherings. They were highly structured events with specific rules about who could attend, how wine should be consumed, what topics could be discussed, and how participants should behave. A proper symposium began with ritual offerings to the gods and continued with carefully orchestrated conversations about philosophy, politics, poetry, and other intellectual topics. The wine was mixed with water in specific proportions, and consumption was regulated by a symposiarch, who controlled the pace and amount of drinking. These events served multiple social functions. They were educational opportunities, where young men could learn from their elders, networking sessions where business and political relationships were developed, and cultural occasions where poetry and music were performed and appreciated. But they also had romantic and sexual dimensions that were openly acknowledged and regulated. Symposiums often included entertainment by heterae or other professional companions, and the relaxed atmosphere created opportunities for the development of romantic relationships between men. The key was maintaining appropriate balance and avoiding behavior that might damage reputations or relationships. There were traditional games, rituals, and conversation topics that helped structure these interactions and prevent them from becoming too chaotic or inappropriate. Married men's participation in symposiums was generally accepted and encouraged, but it had to be balanced with their domestic responsibilities and their wives' expectations. A man who spent too much time at symposiums might be criticized for neglecting his household duties, while a man who avoided them entirely might be seen as antisocial or lacking in proper education. Women, of course, were generally excluded from symposiums, but they had their own parallel social institutions that served similar functions. These included religious gatherings, domestic work parties, and family celebrations that provided opportunities for socializing, networking, and cultural participation. The separation of male and female social worlds wasn't complete, however. There were numerous occasions when men and women interacted in more casual settings, and these interactions were governed by their own complex set of social rules and expectations. Market days, for instance, provided opportunities for married women to leave their homes and interact with a broader range of people. But even these interactions were carefully regulated. Women were expected to be accompanied by servants or relatives, to conduct their business efficiently and modestly, and to avoid unnecessary social conversation. Religious festivals and ceremonies also provided opportunities for mixed social interaction, but again within carefully defined parameters. Men and women might participate in the same rituals, but they usually had separate roles and responsibilities, and their interactions were structured by religious protocol rather than personal choice. Family gatherings were perhaps the most relaxed settings for mixed-gender social interaction. Weddings, funerals, birth celebrations, and other family occasions brought together extended networks of relatives and friends, in settings where normal social restrictions were somewhat relaxed. But even these family events had their own complex social dynamics. There were expectations about how different relatives should interact, what topics of conversation were appropriate, and how various family hierarchies should be acknowledged and maintained. The economic aspects of marriage and family life added another layer of complexity to these social relationships. Marriage wasn't just a personal and religious institution, it was an economic partnership that involved the management of property, the coordination of business activities, and the planning for future financial security. Greek marriage law was quite sophisticated in its treatment of property rights and economic responsibilities. Wives retained certain rights to their dowries and could, under specific circumstances, initiate divorce proceedings if their economic interests were threatened. Husbands had primary responsibility for managing household finances, but they were legally accountable for their stewardship of their wives' property. These economic arrangements required ongoing negotiation and coordination between spouses. Major financial decisions often required consultation with extended family members, and there were social expectations about transparency and fairness in economic matters. Business partnerships between families were often cemented by marriage alliances, creating complex networks of economic and social relationships that extended far beyond the immediate couple. A successful marriage might enhance both families' business prospects, while a failed marriage could damage economic relationships for generations. The pressure to maintain successful marriages was therefore not just personal and social, but economic as well. Couples were expected to work together to preserve and enhance their joint economic position, and failure to do so could have serious consequences for their extended families and business associates. This economic dimension of marriage also affected the social dynamics within households. Wives who brought substantial dowries or who had important family business connections might have more influence in household decision-making than wives who were economically dependent on their husbands. Servants and slaves were another important element in Greek household dynamics. Most middle-class and wealthy families had domestic help, and the management of these relationships was a significant aspect of married life, particularly for wives who were responsible for household administration. The relationship between family members and domestic staff was complex and varied considerably depending on the family's economic status, social position, and personal values. Some families treated their servants almost as extended family members, while others maintained strict hierarchical relationships. Wives often developed close relationships with female servants, who might serve as confidantes, advisors, and companions in the socially isolated world of the Greek household. These relationships could be quite intimate and emotionally significant, sometimes more so than relationships with female relatives or neighbors. The presence of domestic staff also affected the relationship dynamics between spouses. Servants might serve as intermediaries in marital conflicts, as sources of information about each spouse's activities and relationships, or as witnesses to private family matters. Managing these household relationships required considerable social skill and emotional intelligence. Wives had to balance maintaining authority with building loyalty, ensuring efficiency with preserving harmony, and protecting family privacy with maintaining open communication. The agricultural calendar also played a major role in organizing Greek family life. Most Greek communities were primarily agricultural, and the seasonal cycle of planting, cultivation, and harvest created rhythms that affected every aspect of social and domestic life. During planting and harvest seasons, entire households might be mobilized for agricultural work. Normal social activities might be suspended, religious observances might be modified, and family relationships might be temporarily restructured to meet the demands of agricultural production. These seasonal rhythms created opportunities for different types of social interaction and family cooperation. Extended family members might come together to help with major agricultural tasks, creating occasions for socializing and relationship building that weren't possible during other parts of the year. The agricultural calendar also influenced marriage timing, religious observances, and social celebrations. Many weddings were scheduled to avoid conflict with major agricultural activities. Religious festivals were often tied to agricultural cycles, and social visiting patterns were adjusted to accommodate the demands of farming life. For urban families who weren't directly involved in agriculture, the agricultural calendar still had significant effects on social and economic life. Food prices fluctuated seasonally, trade patterns changed with agricultural cycles, and the overall pace of social activity varied depending on agricultural demands. The clothing and fashion customs of ancient Greece added yet another dimension to the social complexity of married life. What people wore wasn't just about personal style or comfort. It was a complex system of social signaling that communicated information about status, wealth, family connections, and personal values. Married women's clothing was particularly loaded with social meaning. The style, color, fabric, and ornamentation of their garments communicated information about their husband's prosperity, their own family background, their personal modesty and virtue, and their adherence to proper social conventions. The peplos and chiton, the primary garments worn by Greek women, might appear simple to modern eyes, but they were actually quite sophisticated in their social messaging. The way these garments were draped, pinned, and accessorized could convey subtle information about the wearer's social position and personal circumstances. Jewelry and ornamentation were even more complex in their social significance. Married women were expected to wear certain types of jewelry that signified their married status, but the specific pieces and their arrangement communicated additional information about family wealth, religious affiliations, and personal taste. The management of a married woman's wardrobe was therefore a significant social and economic responsibility. Husbands were expected to provide their wives with clothing appropriate to their social status, but wives were responsible for maintaining and coordinating their appearance in ways that reflected well on the entire household. This created interesting dynamics between spouses about fashion choices and spending priorities. A wife who dressed too expensively might be criticized for extravagance, while a wife who dressed too modestly might be seen as reflecting poorly on her husband's prosperity. Men's clothing was somewhat less complex in its social messaging, but it still carried significant meaning about status, occupation, and personal values. The quality and style of a man's Hermetian cloak and chiton, tunic, communicated information about his economic position and social aspirations. Military and athletic clothing had special significance in Greek male culture. The proper equipment and attire for gymnasium activities or military service were important markers of citizenship and social standing. A man who couldn't afford proper athletic gear might be excluded from gymnasium culture entirely, which could seriously damage his social and political prospects. But here's where things get particularly interesting from our modern perspective. Athletic activities in ancient Greece were conducted entirely in the nude. The word gymnasium literally means place of nakedness, and this wasn't just about athletic practicality. It was a fundamental aspect of Greek male social culture that had profound implications for relationships, social hierarchies, and personal development. The practice of nude athletics wasn't considered sexual or inappropriate, but it was deeply connected to Greek ideas about the male body, physical perfection, and social bonding. Young men exercising together, competing in various sports, and socializing in the nude created an environment where physical appearance, athletic ability, and personal charisma all played important roles in social positioning. This nude athletic culture was also where many of the most important male relationships in Greek society were formed and developed. The gymnasium served as a kind of social laboratory where young men learned to navigate complex relationships with peers, mentors, and potential romantic partners. The mentorship relationships that developed in gymnasium settings were particularly important and complex. Older men, usually in their 20s and 30s, would take younger men, typically teenagers, under their wings for guidance in athletics, academics, and social development. These relationships, known as pederastic relationships, were considered not only acceptable but essential for proper male education and development. Now, before modern sensibilities recoil entirely, it's important to understand that these relationships existed within a carefully regulated social framework that was quite different from anything we might recognize today. They weren't simply about physical attraction or exploitation, though those elements certainly existed. They were primarily understood as educational partnerships designed to transmit cultural values, social skills, and intellectual knowledge from one generation to the next. The older partner, called the Pederasty or lover, was expected to serve as a mentor, protector, and guide for the younger partner, called the eromenos or beloved. The Pederasty was responsible for the eromenos's physical training, intellectual development, and social introduction to adult male society. In return, the eromenos was expected to be respectful, attentive, and emotionally responsive to his mentor's guidance. These relationships had clear rules and boundaries that were enforced by social custom, and sometimes by law. The Pederasty was expected to be someone of good character and social standing, who could provide genuine benefit to the eromenos's development. The eromenos was expected to be selective and modest, not accepting attention from inappropriate partners or engaging in behavior that might damage his reputation. The physical aspects of these relationships were acknowledged but carefully regulated. There were specific behaviors that were considered appropriate, and others that were strongly discouraged or forbidden. The goal was to maintain the educational and social value of the relationship while avoiding exploitation or behavior that might damage either partner's future prospects. Parents were generally supportive of appropriate mentor relationships for their sons, seeing them as valuable opportunities for social advancement and education. A son who attracted the attention of a prestigious mentor might gain access to social and educational opportunities that would otherwise be unavailable. Conversely, a son who failed to form appropriate mentor relationships might be seen as lacking in potential or attractiveness. The selection process for these relationships was often quite competitive. Prestigious older men might have multiple younger men seeking their attention, while particularly attractive or promising young men might receive approaches from several potential mentors. The social dynamics involved could be quite complex, involving not just the immediate participants but also their families, friends, and broader social networks. These relationships typically evolved over time, as the Eromenos matured and eventually became ready to take on the Pederasty role himself with a new generation of younger men. The transition was marked by various social rituals and ceremonies that formally recognized the change in status and responsibility. Successful mentor relationships could create lasting bonds that continued throughout both partners' lives. Former Eromenos and Pederasty might remain close friends, business partners, or political allies long after the formal mentoring period had ended. These networks of relationships built through the Gymnasium system were crucial elements in Greek political and social life, but the Gymnasium culture also created its own problems and tensions. Competition for prestigious partners could become quite intense, sometimes leading to conflicts between rivals or disappointment for those who were overlooked. The emphasis on physical appearance and athletic ability could be psychologically damaging for young men who didn't measure up to idealized standards. There were also ongoing tensions between Gymnasium culture and family life. Men who became too absorbed in Gymnasium relationships might neglect their domestic responsibilities or fail to give appropriate attention to their wives and children. Wives sometimes resented the emotional energy their husbands invested in these relationships, though they generally couldn't express such feelings openly. The seasonal rhythms of Gymnasium activities added another layer of complexity to Greek family and social life. Athletic training and competitions were often scheduled around religious festivals, agricultural seasons, and political calendars. During periods of intense athletic activity, normal family routines might be disrupted, and social priorities might shift temporarily. The Gymnasium also served as an important venue for political networking and business relationship development. Men who excelled in athletic competitions or who formed valuable mentor relationships often leveraged these connections for political advancement or business opportunities. The social capital accumulated through Gymnasium participation could be extremely valuable in Greek society, but perhaps most importantly for our understanding of Greek sexuality and relationships, the Gymnasium culture created a social environment where emotional and physical intimacy between men was not only accepted but actively encouraged and celebrated. This created a very different understanding of masculinity and male relationships than what we see in many other historical cultures. Greek men were expected to be emotionally expressive and physically affectionate with other men, particularly within the context of appropriate mentor relationships. This emotional openness was seen as a sign of sensitivity and cultural sophistication, not as a threat to masculine identity or social stability. The poetry and art of the period reflect this cultural attitude, with numerous works celebrating the beauty of male relationships and the emotional intensity of mentor partnerships. These weren't considered controversial or inappropriate, but rather as expressions of the highest forms of human connection and cultural development. This brings us to one of the most distinctive aspects of Greek sexual culture, the way it integrated what we might see as competing or contradictory elements into a coherent social system. Men could simultaneously maintain loving marriages, emotional mentor relationships, intellectual friendships with heterae, and various other social and romantic connections without anyone seeing this as problematic or contradictory. The key was understanding that different types of relationships served different purposes and operated according to different rules. A man's relationship with his wife served reproductive, economic, and domestic purposes. His relationship with a hetaira served intellectual and social purposes. His mentor relationship served educational and emotional purposes. Each had its proper place and function within the broader social system. Disintegration of multiple relationship types was facilitated by the physical separation of different social spheres we mentioned earlier. Because men's and women's social lives were largely separate, and because different types of male relationships occurred in different physical and social contexts, there was less potential for conflict or jealousy between competing relationships. The religious and philosophical frameworks of Greek culture also supported this integration. Greek mythology was full of stories about gods and heroes who maintained multiple romantic relationships simultaneously, and these stories were understood as models for appropriate human behavior rather than as cautionary tales. The philosophical schools that developed during the classical period generally supported the idea that different types of love and relationships could coexist harmoniously if they were properly understood and managed. Platonic philosophy, in particular, developed sophisticated theories about the hierarchy of different types of love and their appropriate roles in human development. But this integration wasn't always smooth or unproblematic. There were ongoing tensions between different relationship obligations, competing demands for time and attention, and conflicts between individual desires and social expectations. Greek literature and drama are full of stories exploring these tensions and their sometimes tragic consequences. The institution of marriage, in particular, sometimes struggled to find its place within this complex system of relationships. While marriage was essential for reproduction and household management, it was not necessarily seen as the primary source of emotional fulfillment or intellectual stimulation for either partner. This created interesting dynamics within marriages. Couples who developed genuine affection and compatibility might find their marriages quite satisfying, but couples who remained formal and distant might find fulfillment primarily through their other relationships. Both patterns were considered socially acceptable, though genuine marital affection was generally preferred when it occurred naturally. The children produced by these marriages often grew up observing this complex system of adult relationships and learning to navigate its intricacies themselves. Boys, in particular, were socialized from an early age to understand the different types of relationships they would eventually be expected to maintain as adult men. Girls, conversely, were prepared primarily for their roles as wives and mothers, with less exposure to the broader range of relationship possibilities available to men. This gender asymmetry was one of the most problematic aspects of the Greek system from a modern perspective, but it was so deeply embedded in the culture that few Greeks questioned it at the time. The training that young people received in relationship skills was quite sophisticated, involving not just practical instruction but also exposure to literature, philosophy, and religious teachings that explored the complexities of human relationships. Young men in particular were expected to develop considerable sophistication in managing multiple relationships and understanding their appropriate boundaries and obligations. This education in relationship management was considered as important as training in athletics, rhetoric, or political skills. A man who couldn't navigate the social complexities of Greek relationship culture would be severely disadvantaged in his personal, professional, and political life. The seasonal festivals and religious celebrations we mentioned earlier played crucial roles in this relationship education. These events provided opportunities for young people to observe adult relationship dynamics, practice appropriate social skills, and gradually take on greater responsibilities within the community's social system. The festival of Anthesteria, for example, was a 3-day celebration of wine, flowers, and fertility that involved complex interactions between different social groups and relationship types. Young people used these occasions to learn about appropriate behavior in mixed social settings, while adults used them to maintain and develop their various relationships. During Anthesteria, normal social restrictions were temporarily relaxed, allowing for more open expression of affection and desire between various types of partners. But this relaxation was carefully structured and controlled, with specific traditions and rituals that channeled behavior in socially acceptable directions. The wine consumption that was central to many Greek festivals deserves special attention because it played such an important role in facilitating social and romantic relationships. Wine wasn't just consumed for its intoxicating effects but was used as a sophisticated social tool for creating intimacy, reducing inhibitions, and facilitating communication between people who might otherwise find direct interaction difficult. The mixing of wine with water in specific proportions was both a practical measure to control intoxication and a symbolic act that represented the proper balance of passion and reason in human relationships. Too much wine led to chaos and inappropriate behavior, while too little failed to create the relaxed atmosphere necessary for genuine social connection. The serving and sharing of wine was governed by elaborate rituals that reinforced social hierarchies, while simultaneously creating opportunities for more intimate interaction. The symposiarch, who controlled wine distribution, had considerable power to influence the social dynamics of any gathering, and skilled hosts could use wine service to orchestrate complex social interactions. These wine-centered social events were where many important relationships were initiated, developed, and sometimes concluded. The relaxed atmosphere created by moderate wine consumption allowed people to express feelings and desires that might otherwise remain hidden, while the social structure of the events provided frameworks for appropriate response and behavior. But wine culture also created its own problems and dangers. Excessive consumption could lead to inappropriate behavior, damaged relationships, and loss of social standing. Men who couldn't control their drinking might find themselves excluded from important social events, while women who were associated with excessive drinking might suffer serious damage to their reputations. The management of alcohol consumption was therefore an important social skill that young people had to master as they came of age. Parents, mentors, and community elders all played roles in teaching appropriate drinking behavior and helping young people avoid the social pitfalls associated with excessive consumption. The connection between wine, sexuality, and religious observance was particularly complex in Greek culture. Many religious festivals involved ritual consumption of wine as a means of achieving communion with various gods, particularly Dionysus, the god of wine and fertility. But these religious uses of alcohol were carefully distinguished from secular social drinking. The cult of Dionysus was especially important in this regard because it provided a religious framework for expressing aspects of sexuality and desire that might otherwise be problematic. During Dionysiac festivals, participants could engage in behavior that would normally be considered inappropriate or scandalous, but which was understood as religious expression rather than mere self-indulgence. These religious festivals served important psychological and social functions by providing outlets for desires and emotions that were otherwise strictly controlled. They allowed people to experience aspects of themselves and their relationships that were normally suppressed, while maintaining the overall structure of social order and moral restraint. The integration of sexuality and religious observance was much more explicit in Greek culture than in many later Western traditions. Sexual desire was understood as a divine force that required proper honor and management rather than simple suppression. This led to religious practices that openly celebrated sexual themes and encouraged appropriate expression of erotic energy. The temple prostitution that existed in some Greek cities was one manifestation of this integration of sexuality and religion. Certain temples, particularly those dedicated to Aphrodite, employed sacred prostitutes who provided sexual services as a form of religious ritual. This wasn't considered degrading or immoral, but rather as a sacred service that honored the goddess and provided worshippers with access to divine energy. These sacred prostitutes were often highly educated and respected members of their communities, more similar to the hetairai than to common prostitutes. They served religious, social, and educational functions in addition to providing sexual services, and their temples were important centers of cultural and intellectual life. The income generated supported not just the individual prostitutes but also the temples and the broader religious community. This created an economic system that integrated sexuality, religion, and community support in ways that seem quite foreign to modern sensibilities. But it's important to understand that temple prostitution wasn't simply about commercializing sex. It was part of a broader understanding of sexuality as a sacred force that required proper ritual expression and community management. The religious framework provided structure and meaning that distinguished these activities from mere commercial transactions. The decline of temple prostitution in later periods was partly due to changing religious attitudes, but also reflected broader changes in Greek economic and social organization. As Greek cities became more integrated into larger political and economic systems, local religious practices that seemed exotic or inappropriate to outside observers came under increasing pressure. The Roman conquest of Greece brought particularly significant changes to Greek sexual and religious practices. Roman attitudes toward sexuality were quite different from those of the Greeks, emphasizing different virtues and social arrangements. Roman law and administrative practices gradually replaced many traditional Greek customs, though the process of change was slow and often incomplete. The rise of Christianity in the later Roman period brought even more dramatic changes to sexual attitudes and practices. Christian sexual ethics were fundamentally different from those of classical Greek culture, emphasizing monogamous marriage, sexual restraint, and the separation of sexuality from religious observance. But even as the specific practices of ancient Greek sexual culture disappeared, many of the underlying issues and tensions remained. Questions about the relationship between different types of love, the integration of sexuality and spirituality, the balance between individual desire and social obligation, and the role of physical beauty in human relationships continued to challenge later cultures. The literary and artistic legacy of Greek sexual culture also continued to influence later generations. Greek poetry, drama, and visual art provided models and inspiration for later explorations of love, desire, and relationship complexity. Writers and artists throughout Western history have returned repeatedly to Greek themes and stories in their own work. Tranquil, the philosophical legacy has been perhaps even more important. Greek thinkers developed sophisticated theories about love, desire, and human relationships that continued to influence Western thought for centuries. Platonic theories of love, in particular, became fundamental elements in Christian, Islamic, and secular philosophical traditions, but this philosophical influence was often quite different from the original Greek understanding. Later thinkers frequently spiritualized or abstracted Greek ideas about love and sexuality, removing them from their original social and physical contexts. What had been integrated approaches to sexuality and relationships became divided into separate spiritual and physical categories. This division created new tensions and problems that Greek culture had largely avoided through its integration of different relationship types and its acceptance of sexuality as a natural part of human experience. Later cultures often struggled with conflicts between spiritual and physical desires that Greeks had managed more successfully. The rediscovery of original Greek texts and practices during the Renaissance and later periods often came as a shock to people raised in Christian sexual traditions. The openness and complexity of Greek sexual culture seemed both fascinating and threatening to societies that had developed very different approaches to these issues. Modern attempts to understand and evaluate Greek sexual practices have been complicated by changing attitudes towards sexuality, gender relations, and social organization. Practices that seemed natural and appropriate to the Greeks often appear problematic or disturbing to modern sensibilities, while aspects of Greek culture that seemed problematic to earlier generations sometimes appear more reasonable to contemporary observers. The scholarly study of Greek sexuality has also been influenced by broader changes in historical methodology and social theory. Earlier historians often ignored or minimized sexual themes in their accounts of Greek culture, while more recent scholars have sometimes emphasized these themes at the expense of other important aspects of Greek life. Finding a balanced understanding requires recognizing both the genuine insights and innovations of Greek sexual culture and its limitations and problems. The Greeks developed sophisticated approaches to managing complex relationship systems and integrating sexuality with other aspects of social life, but these approaches also involve significant gender inequality and social exclusion. The integration of multiple relationship types that we've discussed throughout this exploration was perhaps the Greeks' most distinctive contribution to understanding human sexuality and relationships. Their recognition that different relationships could serve different purposes without necessarily competing or conflicting was genuinely innovative and remains relevant to contemporary discussions about relationship diversity and complexity. But this integration was achieved partly through social arrangements that most modern people would find unacceptable, particularly the restriction of women's social and sexual autonomy. The Greek system worked for those who had access to its full range of relationship possibilities, but it excluded or marginalized many people who couldn't participate equally in its social structures. The educational aspects of Greek sexual culture also offer both insights and cautionary lessons for modern societies. The Greek emphasis on teaching young people to navigate complex relationship dynamics and manage multiple social obligations was genuinely valuable, but it was embedded in social hierarchies and power relationships that created opportunities for exploitation and abuse. The religious integration of sexuality was another area where Greek culture offered both innovations and problems. The recognition of sexual desire as a natural and potentially sacred aspect of human experience was psychologically and spiritually healthy, but the specific practices through which this recognition was expressed sometimes involved exploitation or degradation of vulnerable people. As we reach the end of our journey through the labyrinthine world of ancient Greek sexual and social practices, it becomes clear that their society was simultaneously more sophisticated and more problematic than simple historical summaries usually suggest. They created solutions to social and psychological problems that other cultures have struggled with for centuries, but they also created new problems and injustices that had their own serious consequences. The Greeks understood something important about human nature and social organization, that people are complex beings with multiple needs and desires that can't always be satisfied through a single type of relationship or social arrangement. Their willingness to acknowledge this complexity and create social structures that accommodated it was genuinely innovative, but they also demonstrated how even sophisticated social innovations can become vehicles for perpetuating inequality and injustice. Their complex relationship systems worked well for those who had access to them, but they often excluded or marginalized people who lacked the social status, economic resources, or personal characteristics necessary for full participation. Perhaps most importantly, the Greeks showed both the possibilities and the limitations of trying to manage human sexuality and relationships through social engineering and cultural control. Their elaborate customs, rituals, and institutions provided structure and meaning for many people's lives, but they also created pressure, anxiety, and disappointment for those who couldn't or wouldn't conform to social expectations. The story of Greek sexual culture is ultimately a story about the ongoing human struggle to balance individual desires with social needs, personal fulfillment with community stability, and innovation with tradition. The Greeks found their own solutions to these eternal dilemmas, solutions that worked reasonably well for their particular time and circumstances. Modern societies continue to grapple with many of the same issues, though in different forms and contexts. We may not tie ceremonial knots around our waists or compete for the attention of gymnasium mentors, but we still struggle with questions about relationship diversity, sexual autonomy, gender equality, and the integration of personal desires with social obligations. The Greeks can't provide us with simple answers to these contemporary dilemmas, but their experience can remind us that there are many different ways to organize human sexuality and relationships, each with its own advantages and disadvantages. Their willingness to experiment with complex social arrangements, even when those arrangements sometimes failed or created new problems, offers both inspiration and cautionary lessons for our own time. And so, as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can find some comfort in knowing that humans have always struggled with the complexities of love, desire, and social relationships. The ancient Greeks, for all their marble statues and philosophical sophistication, were wrestling with many of the same questions that keep us awake at night. How do we balance different types of love? How do we maintain relationships across social differences? How do we integrate our physical and emotional needs with our spiritual and intellectual aspirations? Their answers may seem strange or even disturbing to us, but they represent genuine human attempts to create meaning, connection, and fulfillment in a complex and often confusing world. And in that basic human struggle, separated by thousands of years and vastly different circumstances, we can perhaps find some recognition of our own experiences and challenges. Sleep well, and may your dreams be free of ceremonial knots, gymnasium competitions, and the complex social mathematics of ancient relationship management. After all, navigating modern love is complicated enough without having to worry about whether you're properly honoring Aphrodite or maintaining appropriate symposium etiquette. Sweet dreams from ancient Athens, where love was never simple, relationships were never straightforward, and somehow people managed to create one of history's most influential and enduring civilizations anyway. Perhaps there's hope for the rest of us yet, but before you drift off entirely, we should explore some of the more peculiar aspects of Greek sexual culture that haven't quite made it into your average history textbook. Because while we've covered the gymnasium culture and the marriage customs, we've barely scratched the surface of just how creative the ancient Greeks could get when it came to matters of the heart and body. Take, for instance, the practice of thigh sex, or what the Greeks called intercrural intercourse. This wasn't some obscure perversion confined to the shadowy corners of society. This was a mainstream socially acceptable practice that was considered not just normal, but actually preferable to other alternatives in certain contexts. The logic behind this practice was rooted in Greek ideas about appropriate behavior in mentor relationships. Remember those gymnasium partnerships we discussed? Well, the physical aspect of these relationships was supposed to follow very specific rules. Full penetrative sex was generally considered inappropriate and potentially damaging to the younger partner, both physically and socially. But the Greeks weren't about to let social propriety completely suppress physical expression, so they developed this alternative approach that allowed for physical intimacy, while theoretically preserving the younger partner's, shall we say, technical virginity. The older partner would place his member between the younger man's thighs, and satisfaction would be achieved through this method. This practice was so common that it appears regularly in Greek pottery, literature, and art. It wasn't hidden or shameful. It was simply understood as the appropriate way for these relationships to be expressed physically. Greek pottery from the period shows these scenes with the same casualness that other cultures might depict people sharing a meal or playing a game. The philosophical justifications for this practice were quite elaborate. Greek thinkers argued that this approach preserved the essential educational nature of the relationship by avoiding the power dynamics and potential physical harm associated with penetrative sex. It was seen as a more equal and respectful form of physical expression that didn't compromise the younger partner's future social standing. But the practice wasn't limited to mentor relationships. Married couples sometimes employed this technique as a form of birth control, since the Greeks had observed that it didn't lead to pregnancy. In a world where reliable contraception was difficult to obtain, this alternative approach offered couples a way to maintain physical intimacy while controlling family size. The technique was so well established that there were actually instructional guides and advice literature about how to perform it properly. These weren't pornographic materials, but rather serious instructional texts that were considered part of a well-rounded education in human relationships. Some Greek physicians even recommended this practice as healthier than alternatives, arguing that it avoided various medical problems they associated with other forms of sexual activity. Whether their medical reasoning was sound is debatable, but it demonstrates how thoroughly integrated this practice was into Greek thinking about health, relationships, and appropriate behavior. The religious dimensions of this practice were also significant. Some Greek religious traditions taught that this form of intimacy was more spiritually pure than alternatives, because it didn't involve the mixing of bodily fluids in ways that were considered potentially polluting. This religious approval helped normalize the practice across all levels of society. But perhaps most interestingly, this practice was seen as demonstrating sophisticated self-control and cultural refinement. A man who could achieve satisfaction through this method was considered more civilized and disciplined than one who required cruder approaches. It was a mark of education and social sophistication. Moving from the philosophical to the practical, let's discuss another distinctly Greek innovation, the use of olive oil as a sexual lubricant. Now, this might not seem particularly shocking to modern sensibilities, but the Greeks elevated this simple practical solution into an entire cultural institution. Olive oil wasn't just any lubricant in ancient Greece. It was the lubricant. But more than that, it was a symbol of wealth, culture, and proper preparation. The quality of olive oil used in intimate situations was carefully considered and often reflected social status and personal values. High-quality olive oil, the kind produced from the first pressing of the finest olives, was reserved for the most important occasions and relationships. Using inferior oil in intimate situations was considered disrespectful to one's partner and potentially offensive to the gods who were believed to oversee human relationships. The application of olive oil became a ritualized part of Greek sexual culture. Partners would take turns anointing each other, often while reciting poetry or prayers. This wasn't just practical preparation, it was a form of foreplay that emphasized mutual care and respect. Different varieties of olive oil were believed to have different properties and effects. Oil from certain regions was thought to enhance pleasure, while oil from other areas was believed to promote fertility or provide protection against disease. Wealthy Greeks maintained collections of olive oils from different sources for different purposes. The olive oil industry actually developed specialized products for intimate use. These were oils that had been infused with various herbs, flowers, and other substances believed to enhance their effectiveness or add pleasant fragrances. The production and sale of these specialty oils was a legitimate and profitable business. The cultural significance of olive oil in Greek sexual practices extended beyond mere utility. The olive tree was sacred to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare, and olive oil was considered a gift from the gods. Using olive oil in intimate contexts was therefore seen as invoking divine blessing on the relationship. The gymnasium culture we discussed earlier was particularly connected to olive oil use. Athletes would oil their bodies before exercising, and this practice extended naturally into the social and romantic relationships that developed in gymnasium settings. The communal nature of oiling and cleaning became part of the bonding process between gymnasium partners. But the Greeks didn't stop at simple olive oil. They developed increasingly elaborate preparations that combined olive oil with various other ingredients to create what we might call ancient personal lubricants. These mixtures included honey, wine, various herbs, and sometimes more exotic ingredients imported from distant lands. Honey was particularly popular as an additive because it was believed to have antimicrobial properties, and because its sweetness was associated with the pleasure of Aphrodite. Wine was added for its relaxing effects and its religious significance in various festivals and ceremonies. The preparation of these intimate oils became a specialized skill that was passed down through families and professional networks. Some individuals became known for their expertise in creating particularly effective or pleasant preparations, and their services were sought after by wealthy clients. They were kept in special containers, often made of precious materials like silver or fine ceramics, that were designed to preserve their quality and prevent contamination. The containers themselves became status symbols and were often given as gifts between lovers or marriage partners. The social etiquette surrounding the use of these oils was quite complex. There were appropriate times and circumstances for different preparations, proper methods for application, and expected behaviors during and after use. Getting these social details wrong could cause embarrassment or offense, but perhaps most remarkably, the use of olive oil and related preparations was completely open and socially acceptable. These products were sold in public markets, discussed in polite company, and referenced in literature and art, without embarrassment or censorship. This openness extended to discussions about sexual techniques and practices more generally. The Greeks had a remarkably frank and educational approach to sexual knowledge that contrasts sharply with the secrecy and shame that characterized many later cultures. Young people received explicit instruction in sexual techniques as part of their general education. This wasn't considered inappropriate or corrupting, but rather as essential knowledge for successful adult relationships. Parents, mentors, and professional teachers all played roles in providing this education. The instruction covered not just mechanical techniques, but also emotional and social aspects of sexual relationships. Young people learnt about communication, consent, mutual pleasure, and the integration of physical intimacy with emotional connection and social responsibility. This educational approach was supported by a rich literature of instructional texts, philosophical discussions, and artistic representations. Greek libraries contained numerous works on sexual techniques, relationship management, and the philosophical dimensions of physical love. Some of the most respected philosophers and writers of the period contributed to this literature. These weren't considered pornographic or disreputable works, but rather as serious contributions to human knowledge and cultural development. The artistic representations of sexual activities in Greek pottery, sculpture, and wall paintings were equally frank and educational. These works were displayed in homes, public buildings, and religious sites without controversy or embarrassment. But this openness wasn't unlimited or chaotic. Greek sexual culture operated within clear moral and social boundaries that distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate behavior, even while being remarkably permissive by the standards of many other cultures. The key principle was that sexual activity should serve positive social and personal purposes, rather than merely indulging physical desires. Sex that strengthened relationships, contributed to education, or honored the gods was considered good and beneficial. Sex that was purely selfish, exploitative, or socially destructive was condemned. This principle-based approach allowed the Greeks to be simultaneously permissive and moral, open and responsible. They could discuss and practice a wide range of sexual activities while maintaining clear standards about when and how these activities were appropriate. The seasonal and religious calendar that we mentioned earlier played a major role in structuring this approach to sexual morality. Certain times of year were considered particularly auspicious for different types of sexual activities, while other periods were designated for restraint and spiritual focus. The festival of Aphrodisia, for example, was a time when sexual expression was not just permitted but actively encouraged as a form of religious worship. During this festival, normal social restrictions were relaxed, and couples were expected to engage in intimate activities as a way of honoring the goddess of love. But these periods of sexual freedom were balanced by times of restraint, such as during certain mourning periods or before important religious ceremonies. This rhythm of indulgence and restraint was seen as psychologically and spiritually healthy. The religious dimensions of Greek sexual culture extended far beyond occasional festivals. Many Greeks believed that sexual energy was a form of divine force that required proper respect and management. This led to practices that might seem strange to modern sensibilities but which made perfect sense within their spiritual framework. For instance, many Greek households maintained small shrines to Priapus, a god associated with fertility and sexual potency. These shrines weren't hidden away in private chambers but were often located in gardens or courtyards where they could be seen and honored by family members and guests. The statues of Priapus were notably anatomically explicit, featuring exaggerated male genitalia that was understood as a symbol of life-giving power rather than mere sexual arousal. Couples would make offerings at these shrines before important intimate encounters, seeking divine blessing for their activities. The offerings themselves reveal a lot about Greek attitudes toward sexuality. Common gifts to Priapus included flowers, fruits, wine, and olive oil, all substances associated with fertility and pleasure. But couples also offered personal items like jewelry or clothing, symbolically dedicating their intimate relationship to divine protection. These religious practices weren't considered primitive or superstitious by educated Greeks. They were understood as sophisticated theological approaches to integrating human sexuality with cosmic spiritual forces. Greek philosophers developed elaborate theories about how sexual energy connected individual humans to universal creative principles. The Platonic school, in particular, developed a complex hierarchy of different types of love, ranging from purely physical attraction to spiritual communion with divine beauty. But importantly, this hierarchy didn't condemn physical love as inferior or evil. Rather, it saw physical attraction as the beginning of a spiritual journey that could potentially lead to higher forms of understanding. This philosophical approach had practical effects on how Greeks conducted their relationships. Many couples understood their physical intimacy as having spiritual dimensions that elevated it above mere bodily pleasure. They approached sexual activities with a sense of reverence and purpose that transformed the experience into something approaching religious ritual. The preparation rituals we mentioned earlier, the bathing, the anointing with oils, the prayers and offerings, were all part of this spiritualized approach to sexuality. These weren't just practical preliminaries, they were sacred activities that prepared the participants for communion with divine forces. But the Greeks also recognized that this spiritual approach to sexuality required considerable maturity and self-discipline. Not everyone was considered ready for the more advanced forms of sexual spiritual practice, and there were educational progressions that individuals were expected to follow as they developed greater understanding and capability. Young people typically began with relatively simple physical relationships that emphasized pleasure, companionship, and basic emotional connection. As they matured and gained experience, they might progress to more complex relationships that integrated physical intimacy with intellectual discourse, artistic creation, or spiritual practice. The most advanced practitioners might eventually achieve what the Greeks called sacred marriage, a form of relationship that completely integrated physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual dimensions. These relationships were rare and highly respected, representing the highest achievement of Greek relationship culture. But even ordinary relationships were expected to evolve and deepen over time. Couples who remained stuck at purely physical levels of interaction were considered immature and incomplete in their development. There was social pressure to continuously develop greater sophistication in relationship skills and understanding. This expectation of relationship development was supported by ongoing education and guidance from more experienced community members. Married couples might consult with mentors or advisors when they encountered difficulties or wanted to deepen their connection. Professional relationship counselors, similar to modern therapists, existed in some Greek cities. These were usually philosophers or religious figures who specialized in helping people navigate the complexities of intimate relationships. The advice literature of the period includes numerous works that could be considered early marriage manuals, offering guidance on everything from sexual techniques to conflict resolution, to the integration of family life with broader social responsibilities. But perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Greek relationship culture was its recognition that successful relationships required ongoing effort and attention. The elaborate courtship rituals, wedding ceremonies, and post-marriage customs were all designed to reinforce the idea that relationships were serious undertakings that deserved careful cultivation. This attitude toward relationships as requiring skill and effort extended to all types of intimate connections, not just marriages. The mentor relationships in gymnasium culture, the intellectual partnerships with heterai, and even casual sexual encounters were all expected to be conducted with attention to the needs and dignity of all participants. The social consequences for failing to meet these relationship standards could be severe. Men who were considered selfish or inconsiderate lovers might find themselves excluded from social networks and professional opportunities. Women who failed to maintain appropriate relationship skills might struggle to find satisfactory partnerships or maintain their social standing. But the Greeks also provided extensive support for people who wanted to improve their relationship capabilities. The educational system, the mentorship networks, the philosophical schools, and the religious institutions all offered resources for personal development in this area. This comprehensive approach to relationship education and support was one of the most innovative aspects of Greek culture. They understood that successful intimate relationships were crucial for individual happiness and social stability, and they organized their entire society to promote relationship success. The artistic and literary culture of ancient Greece both reflected and reinforced these relationship values. Greek poetry, drama, sculpture, and painting celebrated the beauty and complexity of human relationships while also exploring their challenges and potential failures. The great tragic dramas, for instance, often dealt with relationship failures and their consequences. These weren't just entertainment. They were educational tools that helped audiences understand the importance of proper relationship conduct and the dangers of violating relationship norms. But Greek art also celebrated relationship successes and provided models for proper conduct. The numerous artistic depictions of loving couples, devoted friends, and respectful mentorships offered visual examples of appropriate relationship behavior. The integration of relationship themes into public art meant that these values were constantly reinforced in daily life. Greeks couldn't walk through their cities without encountering artistic reminders of the importance of relationships and examples of proper relationship conduct. This artistic reinforcement was particularly important for young people who were still learning appropriate relationship behaviors. The public art served as a continuous education system that supplemented formal instruction and family guidance. But the artistic celebration of relationships wasn't limited to idealized or morally instructive examples. Greek art also depicted the full range of human relationship experiences, including passion, jealousy, conflict, and reconciliation. This comprehensive artistic approach helped Greeks understand that relationships were complex and sometimes difficult, but that the challenges were worth facing because of the potential rewards. The art taught that relationship problems were normal and solvable rather than shameful or hopeless. The pottery paintings that have survived from ancient Greece provide particularly intimate glimpses into daily relationship life. These images show couples in private moments, friends sharing confidences, families celebrating together, and individuals preparing for romantic encounters. These domestic scenes reveal the gentleness and affection that characterized many Greek relationships, countering modern stereotypes about ancient societies being harsh or emotionally distant. The pottery shows people kissing, embracing, playing together, and caring for each other in ways that appear remarkably familiar to modern viewers. But the pottery also reveals some of the more unusual aspects of Greek relationship culture that we've been exploring: the images of intercrural sex, the elaborate grooming rituals, the religious ceremonies, and the complex social interactions all appear regularly in this domestic art. This suggests that these practices were indeed normal parts of everyday life, rather than exotic behaviors confined to elite circles or special occasions. Ordinary Greeks apparently conducted their relationships according to these complex customs and found them natural and satisfying. The economic records that have survived from ancient Greece also provide insights into the practical aspects of relationship culture. The expense accounts of wealthy families show significant spending on relationship-related items: fine oils, perfumes, jewelry, clothing, and gifts for partners and potential partners. But these records also show that relationship expenses weren't limited to the wealthy. Even modest families allocated substantial portions of their budgets to relationship-related purchases, suggesting that these practices were important enough to justify significant financial sacrifice. The professional services related to relationship culture also represented a substantial part of the Greek economy. Cosmeticians, perfumers, clothing designers, jewelry makers, and relationship advisors all made their livings serving the relationship needs of Greek society. The prostitution industry, including both common prostitutes and the more elite hetairai, was a major economic sector that employed thousands of people and generated substantial tax revenue for Greek cities. This wasn't a marginal or criminal enterprise, but a legitimate part of the economic system. The Gymnasium system itself represented enormous public investment in relationship culture. The construction and maintenance of gymnasium facilities, the employment of trainers and teachers, and the organization of athletic competitions required substantial resources that Greek cities willingly provided. All of this economic activity suggests that the Greeks considered relationship culture to be not just personally important, but also socially and economically valuable. They were willing to invest significant resources in supporting the complex relationship systems we've been describing, but this investment also created economic pressures and inequalities that affected how relationship culture actually functioned. Wealthy individuals had access to better oils, finer clothing, more skilled advisors, and more attractive partners than poorer people. These economic disparities meant that relationship culture, despite its theoretical emphasis on personal merit and compatibility, was significantly influenced by social class and financial resources. The most satisfying and sophisticated relationships were often available primarily to those who could afford them. Poor young men might struggle to find mentors or participate fully in gymnasium culture. Poor young women might have limited marriage prospects or might be forced into prostitution. These economic realities created significant suffering and inequality within what was otherwise a sophisticated and humane approach to relationships. The slavery system that underpinned the Greek economy also had complex effects on relationship culture. Slaves were excluded from many aspects of Greek relationship culture, but they were also sometimes integrated into it in problematic ways. Wealthy Greeks sometimes formed romantic or sexual relationships with their slaves, but these relationships operated under completely different rules and protections than relationships between free citizens. The power imbalances involved created opportunities for exploitation and abuse that contradicted the relationship values that Greeks applied to free people. But some slaves did manage to form genuine relationships with their owners or with other free people, and occasionally these relationships led to freedom and full social integration. The famous hetaira Aspasia, whom we mentioned earlier, may have originally been a slave who gained her freedom and eventually became one of the most influential women in Athens. The military culture of ancient Greece also had significant effects on relationship patterns. The constant warfare that characterized Greek political life meant that men were frequently away from home for extended periods, disrupting normal relationship routines and family life. But military service also created its own relationship culture. Soldiers formed intense bonds with their comrades that often had romantic and sexual dimensions. The famous Sacred Band of Thebes was an elite military unit composed entirely of male lovers who were thought to fight more bravely because they were defending their beloved partners. These military relationships followed many of the same patterns as civilian mentor relationships, with older, more experienced soldiers taking younger men under their protection and guidance. But the life and death pressures of warfare intensified these relationships in ways that civilian partnerships rarely experienced. The return of soldiers from military campaigns often required complex readjustments in civilian relationships. Wives had to reintegrate husbands who had been away for months or years, and husbands had to readjust to domestic life after the intense camaraderie of military service. These military-civilian transitions were supported by various social customs and rituals designed to help both partners readjust to peacetime relationship patterns. Religious ceremonies, community celebrations, and family gatherings all played roles in facilitating these transitions, but the psychological effects of warfare on relationship culture were profound and not always successfully managed. Veterans returning from traumatic military experiences sometimes struggled to reconnect with their civilian relationships, leading to family problems and social disruption. The Greek medical tradition recognized what we might call post-traumatic stress and developed various treatments for soldiers who had difficulty readjusting to civilian life. Some of these treatments specifically addressed relationship problems caused by military service. The seasonal patterns of Greek military campaigns meant that these relationship disruptions followed predictable rhythms. Families learned to adjust their relationship expectations and activities to accommodate the annual cycle of military service. Spring departures for military campaigns were often marked by elaborate farewell rituals that served both religious and psychological functions. These ceremonies helped couples prepare emotionally for separation while invoking divine protection for the absent partner. Autumn returns from successful campaigns were celebrated with Thanksgiving ceremonies that served to reintegrate warriors into civilian relationship culture. These celebrations included both community-wide festivities and private family reunions, but unsuccessful military campaigns which resulted in death, injury, or defeat created different challenges for relationship culture. Widows, orphans, and wounded veterans all required special social support to maintain their integration into the relationship networks that were so central to Greek social life. The Greek approach to death and mourning also had significant implications for relationship culture. The elaborate funeral rituals and extended mourning periods that followed deaths affected the survivor's abilities to form new relationships or maintain existing ones. Widows and widowers faced particular challenges in Greek relationship culture. Remarriage was possible but complicated by social expectations, economic arrangements, and family obligations. The process of transitioning from mourning to new relationship formation required careful navigation of social norms and personal needs. The ancestor worship practices that were common in Greek religious life meant that deceased partners continued to play roles in the lives of survivors. New relationships had to be formed in the context of ongoing obligations to dead spouses, creating complex emotional and practical challenges. But Greek culture also provided support systems for people navigating these difficult transitions. Extended family networks, religious communities, and professional advisors all offered guidance and assistance to those struggling with relationship loss and reconstruction. The philosophical schools developed sophisticated approaches to understanding love, loss, and the formation of new attachments. These philosophical frameworks helped Greeks understand their emotional experiences and make decisions about how to proceed with their relationship lives after major losses. The Stoic school, in particular, offered teachings about acceptance, emotional control, and the proper balance between attachment and detachment that many Greeks found helpful in managing relationship transitions and losses. But the Epicurean school offered a different approach, emphasizing the importance of pleasure and the need to actively pursue satisfying relationships despite the risks of loss and disappointment. These competing philosophical approaches gave Greeks choices about how to understand and manage their relationship experiences. Different individuals could adopt the philosophical framework that best suited their temperament and circumstances. The diversity of philosophical approaches to relationships reflected the broader diversity of Greek relationship culture. Despite the common customs and social norms we've been describing, there was considerable variation in how different individuals and communities actually practiced relationship culture. Regional differences were particularly significant. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and other major cities each developed their own variations on common Greek relationship themes. These regional differences reflected local values, economic conditions, and political arrangements. Spartan relationship culture, for example, was heavily influenced by their military-focused society. Spartan marriages were designed primarily to produce strong warriors, and romantic love was often secondary to genetic and physical considerations. Athenian relationship culture, by contrast, was more influenced by intellectual and artistic values. Athenian marriages and partnerships often emphasized compatibility of minds and cultural sophistication as much as physical attraction or practical considerations. The island communities developed their own relationship patterns that reflected their maritime economies and their connections to international trade networks. These communities often had more cosmopolitan relationship cultures that incorporated influences from other civilizations. The rural agricultural communities maintained relationship traditions that were often more conservative and focused on family continuity and land management. These communities sometimes resisted changes that were accepted in urban areas. But despite these regional variations, the fundamental patterns of Greek relationship culture remained remarkably consistent across different communities and time periods. The emphasis on education, the integration of multiple relationship types, the spiritual dimensions of sexuality, and the sophisticated social support systems were common throughout the Greek world. This consistency suggests that these relationship patterns reflected something fundamental about Greek values and social organization, rather than merely local customs or temporary fashions. The Greeks had developed an approach to relationships that served important psychological and social needs. The longevity of Greek relationship culture also supports this interpretation. These patterns persisted for centuries and influenced later civilizations long after the original Greek political systems had disappeared. The Roman adoption and adaptation of Greek relationship customs, the influence of Greek ideas on early Christian thinking about marriage and sexuality, and the revival of Greek relationship themes during the Renaissance all demonstrate the enduring appeal and effectiveness of Greek approaches to intimate human connections. But this historical influence also reveals some of the limitations and problems of Greek relationship culture. Later civilizations often adopted the attractive aspects of Greek relationship practices while ignoring or modifying the elements that seemed problematic or inappropriate to their own values. The gender inequality that was built into Greek relationship culture was one of the first aspects that later civilizations chose to modify. The Roman system provided women with somewhat more autonomy and legal protections, though it still maintained significant restrictions. Early Christianity rejected many aspects of Greek sexual culture while adopting some of its emphasis on spiritual dimensions of love and relationships. The Christian ideal of monogamous marriage represented both a simplification and a moral critique of the complex Greek system, but even these modifications and critiques acknowledged the sophistication and appeal of Greek relationship culture. Later civilizations felt the need to engage seriously with Greek ideas about love and relationships, even when they ultimately chose different approaches. The modern rediscovery of Greek relationship practices has been equally complex, involving both admiration and criticism. Contemporary scholars and social critics have found both inspiration and warning in the Greek example. The Greek integration of sexuality and spirituality appeals to many modern people who feel that contemporary culture has overly compartmentalized these aspects of human experience. The Greek educational approach to relationship skills also seems valuable to people concerned about the apparent decline of relationship competence in modern societies. But the Greek acceptance of inequality, their tolerance for exploitative relationships, and their exclusion of women from full participation in relationship culture appear deeply problematic to contemporary values about human dignity and equality. This tension between admiration and criticism reflects the ongoing challenge of learning from historical examples while maintaining commitment to contemporary moral insights. The Greeks achieved remarkable sophistication in some aspects of relationship culture while remaining blind to problems that seem obvious from a modern perspective. Perhaps the most valuable lesson from Greek relationship culture is not any specific practice or custom, but rather their general approach of taking relationships seriously as subjects worthy of careful thought, extensive education, and sophisticated social support. The Greeks understood that successful relationships were crucial for both individual fulfillment and social stability. They were willing to invest enormous amounts of time, energy, and resources in developing relationship skills and supporting relationship success. Their mistakes and limitations remind us that good intentions and sophisticated thinking are not sufficient to guarantee just or humane outcomes. Social systems that appear elegant and effective from some perspectives may create serious problems when viewed from others, but their achievements demonstrate that human relationships can be enhanced through education, supported through community resources, and enriched through integration with broader cultural and spiritual values. As you finally drift off to sleep, perhaps you can appreciate both the strangeness and the familiarity of the Greek approach to love and relationships. Their customs may seem bizarre, but their fundamental concerns about finding connection, creating meaning, and building lasting bonds remain as relevant today as they were 25 centuries ago. And if you wake up tomorrow feeling like your own relationship challenges are particularly difficult or unique, remember the young Greek bride wrestling with the knot of Hercules, the Gymnasium mentor trying to balance education with affection, or the Athenian husband managing relationships with his wife, his hetera, and his drinking companions. Human beings have always found ways to make love complicated. The Greeks just did it with more olive oil and better philosophical justifications than most. Sweet dreams, and may your own relationship knots be easier to untangle than those of our ancient predecessors. But wait, we haven't even touched on one of the most fascinating aspects of Greek sexual culture, their absolutely bizarre approach to what we might call sexual medicine. The Greeks believed that sexual health was directly connected to overall physical and mental well-being, but their understanding of how this connection worked would make a modern doctor either laugh or cry. Take, for instance, their theory of seed retention. Greek physicians believed that men possessed a finite amount of vital essence, stored in the form of semen, and that excessive release of this essence could lead to physical weakness, mental confusion, and even early death. This wasn't just folk wisdom, it was serious medical doctrine taught in the schools and practiced by professional healers. But here's where it gets interesting. The Greeks also believed that complete retention of this vital essence was equally dangerous. Stored semen, they thought, could become corrupted if not released periodically, leading to a condition they called semen poisoning, which supposedly caused everything from bad breath to violent mood swings to temporary insanity. So Greek men were caught in a medical catch-22. Release too much vital essence and you'd waste away, but don't release enough and you'd poison yourself from within. The solution, according to Greek medical wisdom, was to maintain the perfect balance through carefully calculated sexual activity. Wealthy Greek men often employed personal physicians, whose job was to monitor their sexual health and prescribe appropriate levels of activity. These weren't just general practitioners offering casual advice, they were specialists who kept detailed records of their patients' sexual behaviors and made precise recommendations about frequency, timing, and technique. The medical texts that have survived from this period read like incredibly detailed instruction manuals. They specify how often men of different ages should engage in sexual activity, what times of day were optimal for different types of encounters, which positions were most medically beneficial, and even what foods should be consumed before and after sexual activity to maximize health benefits. But the Greek approach to sexual medicine wasn't limited to frequency and timing. They also developed elaborate theories about the medical properties of different types of sexual partners and activities. Relations with one's wife were considered medically different from relations with a hetaira, which were different again from relations with a male partner. Each type of relationship was believed to have different effects on the balance of bodily humors, the circulation of vital spirits, and the overall harmony of physical and mental health. A man might be prescribed relations with his wife to treat one condition, visits to a hetaira to address another problem, and gymnasium activities to maintain general fitness. Greek physicians also paid enormous attention to the medical significance of sexual positions. Different positions were prescribed for different health conditions, ages, and constitutional types. There were positions recommended for improving digestion, others for strengthening the back, and some for enhancing mental clarity. The medical literature includes detailed anatomical drawings showing the supposedly optimal angles and movements for various therapeutic purposes. These weren't just about pleasure or even procreation. They were serious medical prescriptions based on theories about how sexual activity affected the flow of vital essences through the body. But perhaps most remarkably, Greek sexual medicine was applied to women as well as men, though the theories involved were even more bizarre. Greek physicians believed that women's health was dominated by the movements and condition of the uterus, which they thought could literally wander around inside the body, causing various symptoms and disorders. The famous wandering womb theory held that an unsatisfied uterus would detach from its normal position and migrate to other parts of the body, causing the symptoms we would now associate with hysteria, anxiety, or depression. The cure, according to Greek medical wisdom, was to lure the wayward uterus back to its proper place through appropriate sexual stimulation. This led to medical treatments that were essentially prescribed sexual activity. Married women suffering from various emotional or physical ailments might be instructed to engage in relations with their husbands more frequently, or in specific ways designed to satisfy their supposedly wandering wombs. But unmarried women or widows presented a more complex medical challenge. Greek physicians developed elaborate procedures for treating these women that involved what we would now recognize as medical vibrators, though the Greeks called them healing implements and used them in formal medical contexts with all the seriousness of any other treatment. These devices were crafted by specialized artisans who worked closely with physicians to create instruments that would provide the precise type of stimulation believed necessary for medical treatment. The devices were made from various materials, wood, ivory, bronze, and were often quite elaborate in their construction and decoration. The use of these medical implements was governed by strict protocols that distinguished therapeutic stimulation from mere pleasure-seeking. The treatments were conducted by trained medical professionals, usually female healers who specialized in women's health issues, and were accompanied by appropriate prayers and purification rituals. But the Greeks didn't limit their sexual medicine to individual treatments. They also developed theories about the medical benefits of various types of community sexual activities. Certain religious festivals, for instance, were believed to have healing properties for participants, and physicians would sometimes prescribe attendance at specific ceremonies as medical treatment. The cult of Dionysus was particularly important in this regard. The ecstatic activities associated with Dionysiac festivals were believed to have powerful therapeutic effects, particularly for conditions involving mental distress or emotional imbalance. Participation in these festivals was sometimes prescribed by physicians as a form of medical therapy. But the medical theories behind these prescriptions were quite sophisticated. Greek physicians believed that the communal release of emotional and physical tensions during religious festivals helped rebalance the individual's internal harmony and restore proper flow of vital essences. It wasn't just about individual pleasure, it was about therapeutic participation in cosmic rhythms. The seasonal timing of these festivals was considered medically significant as well. Different times of year were believed to require different types of therapeutic activities, and the festival calendar was partly organized around these supposed medical necessities. Spring festivals focused on fertility and renewal were prescribed for people suffering from depression or lack of energy. Summer festivals emphasizing physical activity and competition were recommended for those needing to build strength and vitality. Autumn festivals celebrating harvest and abundance were prescribed for anxiety and fears about security. Winter festivals, which often involved indoor activities and close physical contact, were believed to be particularly important for maintaining mental health during the dark months when reduced sunlight supposedly led to imbalances in vital essences. This integration of sexual activity, religious observance, and medical treatment created a remarkably comprehensive approach to health and well-being. The Greeks understood that physical, emotional, spiritual, and social factors all contributed to overall health, and they developed practices that addressed all these dimensions simultaneously. But this holistic approach also created its own problems and complications. The line between medical treatment and religious obligation could become blurred, leading to situations where people felt pressured to engage in activities they might otherwise avoid. The medical authority of physicians gave them considerable power over their patients' intimate lives. A physician's prescription for specific sexual activities carried the weight of both medical expertise and social expectation, making it difficult for patients to refuse or modify treatments they found unpleasant or inappropriate. Women in particular were vulnerable to medical prescriptions that essentially required them to be sexually available to their husbands or to submit to treatments by medical professionals. The wandering womb theory provided a medical justification for controlling women's bodies and behaviors in ways that served male interests more than female health. But it's important to understand that most Greeks genuinely believed in these medical theories and saw them as scientifically sound approaches to healthcare. The physicians who developed these treatments weren't consciously exploiting their patients but were working within the best medical understanding available to their culture. The Greek approach to sexual medicine was also remarkably systematic and evidence-based by the standards of ancient medical practice. Physicians kept detailed records of treatments and outcomes, and they modified their approaches based on observed results. Over time, Greek medical theory evolved and became more sophisticated. Later physicians developed more nuanced understandings of sexual health that moved away from some of the cruder mechanical theories toward more psychological and relational approaches. The influence of philosophical schools on medical practice was particularly important in this evolution. Physicians who were trained in Platonic or Stoic philosophy brought more sophisticated understandings of the relationship between mind and body to their medical practice. These philosophically trained physicians developed approaches to sexual health that emphasized the importance of emotional connection, mutual respect, and spiritual harmony between partners. They moved away from purely mechanical prescriptions toward treatments that addressed the whole person and their relationships. But even as Greek sexual medicine became more sophisticated, it retained some of its fundamental assumptions about the connection between sexual activity and overall health. The idea that sexual satisfaction was necessary for physical and mental well-being remained central to Greek medical thinking throughout the classical period. This medical validation of sexual pleasure was one of the most distinctive aspects of Greek culture compared to many other ancient civilizations. Where other cultures might see sexual pleasure as at best irrelevant to health and at worst dangerous to spiritual development, the Greeks saw it as medically necessary and socially beneficial. This medical approach to sexuality also influenced Greek attitudes towards sexual diversity and experimentation. Activities that might be condemned in other cultures as perverse or unnatural were often seen by the Greeks as potentially therapeutic if conducted under appropriate medical guidance. The famous Greek tolerance for various forms of sexual expression wasn't just about moral permissiveness. It was also based on medical theories about the therapeutic value of different types of sexual experiences. What we might see as unusual sexual practices were often understood by the Greeks as legitimate medical treatments, but this medical framework also created pressures and expectations that could be psychologically damaging. People who couldn't achieve the sexual satisfaction that was supposedly necessary for health might develop anxieties about their physical and mental condition. Men who experienced difficulties with sexual performance might interpret these problems as signs of serious medical conditions requiring elaborate treatments. Women who didn't experience the sexual satisfaction that was supposed to keep their wombs properly positioned might worry about their mental stability and physical health. These medical anxieties were compounded by the social pressures we've discussed throughout this exploration. The combination of social expectations about proper relationship conduct and medical theories about sexual health created a complex web of obligations and concerns that could be quite stressful for individuals trying to navigate them successfully. The economic dimensions of Greek sexual medicine also created additional pressures. Medical consultations, prescribed treatments, and therapeutic implements could be expensive, creating economic barriers to optimal sexual health. Wealthy individuals had access to the best medical advice and most effective treatments, while poorer people had to make do with less sophisticated approaches. This economic stratification of sexual healthcare meant that the benefits of Greek sexual medicine were not equally available to all members of society. The elaborate theories and sophisticated treatments were primarily accessible to the wealthy elite, while ordinary people had to rely on folk remedies and traditional practices. But even among the wealthy, there were ongoing debates about the validity and effectiveness of various sexual medical treatments. Some physicians and philosophers questioned whether the elaborate theories about seed retention, wandering wombs, and therapeutic sexual positions were actually supported by evidence. These medical debates were part of broader intellectual discussions about the nature of health, the relationship between mind and body, and the role of pleasure in human well-being. Greek intellectual culture encouraged questioning and criticism of established ideas, including medical theories. The Hippocratic school, in particular, developed more empirical approaches to medicine that emphasized careful observation and skepticism about theoretical explanations. Some Hippocratic physicians questioned the more elaborate aspects of sexual medicine, while maintaining belief in the basic connection between sexual health and overall well-being. But even critics of specific sexual medical theories generally accepted the fundamental Greek assumption that sexual satisfaction was important for health and happiness. The debates were usually about which theories and treatments were most effective rather than about whether sexual medicine was legitimate at all. Tifo and Kondovang intellectual discussion about sexual medicine was part of the broader Greek culture of rational inquiry and philosophical debate. The Greeks applied the same critical thinking to sexual and medical questions that they applied to political, artistic, and religious issues. The literary and artistic record also reflects these medical concerns about sexual health. Greek poetry, drama, and visual art frequently reference medical theories about sexuality and their implications for human behavior and social organization. The famous Greek tragedies, for instance, often explore the consequences of sexual dissatisfaction or imbalance. Characters who fail to achieve proper sexual health are portrayed as suffering from various physical and mental ailments that drive the dramatic action. But Greek comedy also mocked some of the more elaborate aspects of sexual medicine, suggesting that not all Greeks took these theories entirely seriously. The comedic tradition provided a space for questioning and satirizing medical pretensions while still acknowledging the basic importance of sexual health. This balance between serious medical concern and humorous skepticism reflects the general Greek approach to intellectual and cultural issues. They were capable of taking ideas seriously, while still maintaining critical distance and the ability to laugh at their own pretensions. The international dimensions of Greek sexual medicine also deserve attention. As Greek culture spread throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, Greek medical theories about sexuality influenced other civilizations and were influenced by foreign ideas in return. Egyptian, Persian, Indian, and other medical traditions all contributed elements to the developing Greek understanding of sexual health. This cross-cultural exchange enriched Greek sexual medicine, but also created new complexities and contradictions. Some foreign medical ideas were easily integrated into existing Greek theories, while others challenged fundamental Greek assumptions about sexuality and health. The process of cultural exchange and adaptation was ongoing throughout the classical period. The Roman adoption of Greek sexual medical theories was particularly important for the later history of Western medicine. Roman physicians preserved and transmitted many Greek ideas about sexual health, though they also modified these theories to fit Roman social and cultural values. But the Roman adaptation of Greek sexual medicine was selective, emphasizing some aspects while downplaying others. The Romans were generally less comfortable with the religious and spiritual dimensions of Greek sexual medicine, preferring more practical and mechanical approaches. Early Christian attitudes toward Greek sexual medicine were largely negative, seeing these theories as promoting excessive focus on bodily pleasure at the expense of spiritual development. But some Christian thinkers also recognized the value of Greek insights about the relationship between sexual satisfaction and overall well-being. The medieval preservation and transmission of Greek medical texts meant that Greek sexual medical theories continued to influence Western thought long after the original Greek civilization had disappeared. These ideas were modified and adapted by Islamic, Jewish, and Christian scholars but retained their basic insights about the connection between sexuality and health. The Renaissance rediscovery of original Greek medical texts led to renewed interest in classical approaches to sexual health. Renaissance physicians and philosophers found much to admire in Greek sexual medicine, while also recognizing its limitations and cultural biases. Modern medicine has largely abandoned the specific theories that guided Greek sexual medicine, but it has retained and developed the basic insight that sexual satisfaction is important for overall health and well-being. Contemporary research on sexual health validates many Greek observations while providing more scientific explanations for the phenomena they observed. The Greek emphasis on the psychological and relational dimensions of sexual health has been particularly influential in modern therapeutic approaches. Contemporary sex therapy draws heavily on insights about the importance of communication, emotional connection, and mutual satisfaction that were central to advanced Greek thinking about sexual health. But modern medicine has also rejected many aspects of Greek sexual medicine that we now recognize as based on false assumptions about anatomy and physiology. The wandering womb theory, the mechanical understanding of vital essences, and the prescriptive approach to sexual positions have all been abandoned in favor of more scientifically accurate understandings. The ethical issues raised by Greek sexual medicine continue to be relevant in contemporary discussions about medical authority, patient autonomy, and the appropriate boundaries between medical treatment and personal choice. The Greek experience provides both positive and negative examples for modern medical ethics. As we reach the conclusion of our journey through the labyrinthine world of ancient Greek sexuality, it becomes clear that their culture was remarkable, not just for its specific practices and beliefs, but for its systematic approach to understanding and managing one of the most complex aspects of human experience. The Greeks recognized that sexuality was too important to be left to chance or individual improvisation. They developed elaborate educational systems, social institutions, religious frameworks, and medical theories, all designed to help people achieve satisfying and socially beneficial sexual lives. Their mistakes and limitations remind us that good intentions and sophisticated thinking are not sufficient guarantees of just or humane outcomes. Their achievements demonstrate that human sexuality can be enhanced through education, supported through community resources, and integrated with broader cultural and spiritual values. Perhaps most importantly, the Greeks showed that sexuality is not just a private matter between individuals, but a social phenomenon that affects the entire community. Their recognition of this social dimension led them to take collective responsibility for sexual education and support in ways that many modern societies have yet to match. The complexity and sophistication of Greek sexual culture also reminds us that there are many different ways to organize human relationships, and that our own approaches are not necessarily the only possible or desirable ones. The Greeks found solutions to some problems that we still struggle with while creating other problems that we have largely avoided. Their integration of sexuality with philosophy, art, religion, and medicine created a richness of understanding that we may have lost in our more compartmentalized approach to these issues. But their gender inequalities and social exclusions created injustices that we have worked hard to overcome. As you finally drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can appreciate the remarkable human creativity that went into constructing the elaborate edifice of Greek sexual culture, from the ceremonial wedding knots to the gymnasium mentorships, from the symposium drinking games to the medical prescriptions for sexual health. The Greeks created a comprehensive system for understanding and managing human desire. Whether this system was ultimately successful is a matter of perspective and values. By their own standards, it seems to have worked reasonably well for those who had access to its full benefits. By our standards, it had serious flaws that created unnecessary suffering and inequality. But what is undeniable is that the Greeks took sexuality seriously as a subject worthy of careful thought, systematic study, and social investment. They refused to treat it as either a purely private matter or a simple biological function. Instead, they recognized it as a complex aspect of human experience that deserved the same attention they gave to politics, philosophy, and art. In our own time, when discussions of sexuality often seem to oscillate between clinical detachment and sensationalistic voyeurism, the Greek example reminds us that it is possible to approach these topics with both seriousness and sophistication, both critical intelligence and appreciative wonder. The ancient Greeks may not have had all the answers about human sexuality and relationships, but they certainly knew how to ask interesting questions. And in a world where we are still struggling to understand these fundamental aspects of human experience, their questions may be as valuable as their answers. So sleep well, and dream perhaps of a world where olive oil was the ultimate luxury item, where philosophical discussions about love were considered essential education, and where the complexity of human relationships was celebrated rather than simplified. It was a strange world in many ways, but it was also a world that took the full richness of human experience seriously. And who knows, maybe tomorrow you'll wake up with a new appreciation for the simple fact that you live in a time when untying knots is purely voluntary, when gymnasium culture doesn't require public nudity, and when your choice of sexual positions is a matter of personal preference rather than medical prescription. The ancient Greeks gave us democracy, philosophy, theatre, and the Olympic Games, but perhaps their most lasting contribution was the recognition that human sexuality deserves to be understood not just as a biological drive or a moral problem, but as one of the most complex and fascinating aspects of what it means to be human. Sweet dreams from the Agora of Athens, where love was a subject for both poets and physicians, where pleasure was both a right and a responsibility, and where even the gods were not immune to the delicious complications of desire.